Yeah, well, he doesn't do us any good though. He's cool there. He's
That's amazing.
You don't make the sure. No, okay.
You're on the TV. Second half. It's freeing up space. Sideways shifting of the chair when it's time's up. Oh, my chair. That's what you need.
You must tell me again how to say my tips.
Oh. Basically.
No, but it is it.
Yeah,
I give your house.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is. But I used to do software. Sometimes this is
Sure. Hi, thanks. Good to you.
Okay.
I need
I just.
to show you, but you know, you need a special package.
Okay.
No, but what's the thing? I can just.
You're wanting for such a.
Well, that- I just- I can pass it, yeah.
Captain, can I take a photo?
Yeah.
Good luck with the name, dramatic. This is the name. Exactly, exactly.
First edition.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome on this beautiful spring evening to the European Studies Centre. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our speaker this evening, Professor Ilaria Poggiolini. She's Professor of International History and former Pro-Chancellor for International Relations at the, I've heard, very beautiful University of Pavia. Ilaria's early research touched on peacemaking in Europe in the immediate post-war period, engaging with the cases of Italy, Japan, and Vietnam. More recently and presently, her research engages with issues pertaining to the enlargement of the European Union, the European project and its development, and in particular, Britain's being contested relationship with both the EEC and European Union. It is this later period of research that we are going to be engaging with, and this fantastic new book, very recently published, The Long Disenchantment, Reassessing UK-EU Relations from Accession to Brexit. Those of you who are following UK politics at the moment know that in this immediate period where we're looking at 10 years following the decision to leave the European Union, we're no closer to a reset, we're no closer to a constructive relationship with the European Union, or indeed a coherent narrative as to what the UK's changing relationship with Europe is going to look like, particularly given the challenges that are being faced at the moment, challenges from in relation to migration and refugee protection in my own area, rising populism in the EU and beyond, and spreading conflicts both at Europe's borders and in other parts of the world as well. This book is therefore a really important text for us to engage with. It seeks to replace a comforting European narrative of British missed opportunities by characterising or capturing the complexity of UK EC-EU relations. It engages with historical materials that cover Britain's relationship with the European Union over a considerably longer period of time than many texts looking at the relationship we engage with. And it invites us to rethink, refine, and challenge dominant understandings of Britain as a permanent outsider condemned to irrelevance in relation to the European project. And we're going to hear from Ilaria for around 30 minutes, and to reflect on this work, we have our very own Professor Timothy Garton, whose own political writing you will be very familiar with, A History of the Present. He's charted and continues to engage with the transformation of Europe over the last century, and if I may say, wonderful column in The Guardian last week on the issues we're facing in universities and elsewhere at the moment. So thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really very pleasure for me to be back here. Actually, it's all been said that I was a fellow at Antony College long time ago. Let's not go into details of how long time. And I also have kind of a double life between since then. I've had a double life between this country and Italy, where I then went back teaching at the Università of Pavia. So I have a long-standing relation with this college, and that makes it particularly meaningful for me to be here tonight. What I would like to say, first of all, is that I'm not going to tell you the story of the book. What I'm trying to do is to focus on what really made me think of writing this book and what I've been trying to do with this book, which is basically focusing on what, from the continental point of view, and I think a certain familiarity, I must say by now, with this country, made me think that the narratives we have about Europeanism in general, and then applied, of course, in the very special case of the United Kingdom from the beginning, and really was not enough, was too repetitive, was too biased in many ways. So, and I think the fact that I'm not British maybe allows me to be more understanding of the British case. Perhaps as some historians who are too upset, and maybe British historians too upset to really look back at the case with a certain understanding of the reason why Britain was so different from the beginning. So the first point I want to make particularly this week, that is about victory in Europe, is that victory in Europe is what you would say here. The end of the war is what you would say as a continental European. And that is the beginning of the story. In a way, the story of the European continent facing the post-war period is a story of country devastated by war, but more than that, devastated in their own ambition to play a role. And of course, in some cases it was in Germany, in my own country, not certainly a role to be proud of, but a complete disaster of what they had been trying to achieve, and the punishment that they went through during the war. So is the end of a war. So thank God it's finished. But here is it still victory? Is it still that famous plea that by Churchill? So that is a very important point, because one of the reasons why the path that Britain had in Europe has been so different from that of the continent, famous called, by Garton in 1984, the price of victory compared to the price of defeat. So you start from having a certainty about your identity that has not been challenged, but has been non so terribly shattered, like in the case of the main European countries. So the main point is to try to go back to that and see why the European project that starts with this federalist ambition. And I always say we all have memories this week of family experiences in World War II. My own family, my grandfather and my father were in the resistance, where has former officers turning to the resistance, fought on that side. But when they came out, they sort of had this feeling of inferiority. The occupying power, both the British and the Americans, they were there, and they sort of they felt they've lost their identity, they felt they've lost their dignity in many ways. Okay, so that's the reason why the European project came as the only dream those Europeans at that stage in the beginning of the Cold War, when the power when the superpowers were in control, could think they would do with their own hands. What's the only project that you can actually do at that time was the integration of Europe, and thinking that would lead to a federation, because that would have meant overcoming nationalism, overcoming the horrors they have experienced. On this other side, of course, you have a completely different scenario. I will not go through each famous bits of the story, but another word, there's another phrase that we have heard, particularly in the last few days, the idea of standing alone, and now the realization that Britain didn't stand alone. Of course, this supported by the Commonwealth in resisting and also in victory. So that has been now more recently, particularly in this and in the ceremonies these few days, remember. But still, there is that kind of, there's at the same time, because many on the continent in this Europe started talking about, the arrogance of the arrogance of the British. Actually, more than arrogance, and I think over time, from the continental viewpoint, has been admiration, and admiration on the one hand, and then disappointment on the other. So the kind of the relationship of love and hate that continues all time, because that myth of Britain has the pillar of democracy that didn't come down during the Second World War remains. But the federal project is the continental project. And so one of the main stories that I had to look at, and I looked at more in details from the 1950s onwards, is how different politicians in this country, one after the other, dealt with positioning themselves in relation to to the narratives of the continent, to the European narrative of the federalist, of the Europeanist, of the continental European. Because though the British case is a case the continentals admire and somehow envy, if you want, on the other hand, they thought with constructing Europeanism that they had really reached the moral ground. I mean, they stepped towards something morally good that couldn't be questioned. So there is, on the one hand, you admire the other, the partner that is not in, the one that stays out until quite late, until the 1970s. And the historians continue to talk about missed opportunities, missed buses. As this, Britain was missing all these buses. One of my arguments is that there's nothing to miss. Britain was not missing that design because it was not the kind of framework design Britain wanted to join. That's one of my points regarding that. But this obsession with Britain should have, and the as if is an enormous part of the historiography on Britain in Europe, on Britain outside Europe before accession. And the as if applies to the idea that if Britain had come in earlier, then it would have contributed to the creation of a different Europe, more like what Britain could have actually felt comfortable in. So I don't have so much time. Let me just say, so the narrative of the pre-accession is around the sort of the two myths and the inability to understand from the continental point of view the British reluctance or awkwardness. All these definitions that come again and again in the literature. Most of the time, awkwardness is used. But then at the moment of accession, what I'm trying to say over time, and I will go obviously very quickly, and love your questions afterwards, is that the moment of accession is the moment when an idea of how Britain could contribute to the European construction comes in quite clearly with East. I mean, I know that the poor Edward East has a very bad press, has a domestic politician, but indeed he's the only one who in Europe elaborated a sort of idea of how Britain could combine on the one hand its own uniqueness, and on the other the creation of something that it goes beyond the first Europe, the so-called little Europe of the six, that then with the first enlargement has the potential to become something else, and the potential to open up to the international scenario, to revise and transatlantic relations, to have different involvement in terms of trade around the world and so on. So that moment is extraordinarily important, and I've had the pleasure to discuss this with Ralph Darrell, who was, in the 1970s, the commissioner, dealing exactly with the transatlantic relations. Well, the idea that there could have been, and I written something that is based on his ideas, on Darrell's ideas, of a second Europe. So if Britain could come in with bringing a different approach to European integration, which is not federal, but is based on expanding the base of the policies, the important policies of the community, particularly international relations, but also economic policy, and also sort of make a compromise on monetary policies, so not towards a single currency, but towards an harmonization of monetary policy. So to have a kind of pragmatic, constructive idea of how to enlarge, broaden the scope of the European construction and make it and make use of the strength and the credibility, in a way, of Britain on the international stage. So there is that moment, and there are a number, study very carefully, and a number of occasions in which this new idea is discussed politically. There is also a tendency towards a triangular relationship between East, Brandt, and Pompidou after the war. I've, of course, left out an enormous part, which is the rejection of de Gaulle of the British candidature, which could come back if we want to discussing France and the UK, and discussing the two extraordinary cases of de Gaulle on one hand and Monet on the other, what Monet expected Britain to do and what de Gaulle did. But moving on the opportunity, if there is an opportunity, and it's never discussed as this, but if there is a missed opportunity, my view is to have had a different kind of Europe, is the Europe of the 1970s, which is in the making. It could have been in the making of a second Europe, particularly given the challenges, the changes, the American, the end of the dollar era, and so on and so forth, that are so important in that decade. So what went wrong, obviously, we all know, is the fact that this particular triangular strong relationship between Germany, France, and Britain with these didn't last very long. They all disappeared from the political scene in 1974. It was very soon after accession. So, of course, we cannot make history on the basis of personalities, but those personalities seem to have had a quite clear idea. What we have seen after that, and I think it's important in terms of the narrative. So we say that there is a narrative. We start with these two victories, say, and Federalist Europe. Then there is a narrative of accession that is an adaptation up to a point, because even he's not always made clear. The white paper in 1971 saying, sovereignty is not lost in the European belief that joining doesn't mean losing sovereignty within the European community. After that, with the period, particularly in the first case of renegotiation, so the Wilson, the Labour Party coming back and dealing with more difficulty with a project that has not been theirs, that they inherit, they stand by the idea that Britain will make a success of membership, but also they, for the first time, negotiate on the basis of, we can also use the word withdrawal, withdrawing from the European communities for the first time discussed during renegotiation. So the first time we're in the budget issue that we know, of course, there's been a big issue in the negotiations. But the only point I want to make is that during the negotiation, the long era of the 1960s, from the two rejection by France, and then the third negotiation that East made with success and entering the beginning of the 70s, all that period, not only Britain is trying sort of moving from the original complete attachment to, and we know also for reasons of necessity, to join the community. There is another process which very often is not discussed, which is how enlargement was handled by the existing members. The rules of the game were very vague. So Britain and of course Denmark and Ireland were the first case of new members and the first application, the first to knock at the door of Little Europe. So what I think is very interesting to think is how very difficult was the way in which they were told they will negotiate. It wasn't obvious, it was not in the Treaty of Rome that the entire acquis communautaire was then became the so-called acquis communautaire, so everything that had already existed in the community had to be taken, not negotiated, was unnegotiable. That was not written anywhere. That's how the first enlargement makes the European community, push the European community to fence in, to make sure that everything has been done up to that. That obviously doesn't help in a negotiation. It turns it into a non-negotiation, which is a problem with enlargement, I believe, since then. But that's simply to say that if there is an evolution on the British side, there is also an attempt on the European side to define the future, so protecting the past very strongly. Okay, so the problem with all this and the problem with the first turn towards a more conflictual approach, which is the beginning of the era with the Labour Party coming back and the renegotiation. About the renegotiation and the first referendum, there will also be a huge amount to say. A couple of points I want to make are that first of all, renegotiation, of course, should be then compared, and has been compared, of course, by many, with the renegotiation that Cameron led and handled. But the main point of the first renegotiation to make here is that even the Labour Party have not been the protagonist, not been the promoter of integration originally, negotiated very carefully without pushing. I mean, without pushing to the limit, in a kind of very soft way, if you want, in order to obtain something to present to the public opinion, in order to say, okay, now we can have a referendum because we have achieved some of our objectives. It was really quite cosmetic what was achieved, but it was presented in a way, and also culturally, the government could say this to public opinion at the time, talking about the mid-1970s, and this will not work today. You will not deal with public opinion in the same way. And also, it's also very important, and speaking of narratives, the Eurosceptic vision was not there. There's something that comes much later on, and certainly Cameron had to deal with that, but Wilson didn't. Of course, there were doubts. Many were uncertain about the future in Europe and so on and so forth. But that kind of absolutely virulent Euroscepticism that developed in the 1990s and 2000 wasn't there. So this is another moment in which the narrative tends to stay similar to the idea of adaptation. So Britain is now will stay and will adapt. So the confrontation is not there. The ideological confrontation later on is not there. The reason for this is that if we go and see, I found two very interesting sources two sources that made me really help in thinking about Europe has perceived at the time in Britain. One is the Andrew Schoenfield Reith lectures, a number of lectures that he gave. And the other one outside Britain is a report by Leo Tindemans. Why am I mentioning these two apparently completely distant and unrelated people? But because they both discuss what the meaning of European Union. They talk about federalism, and then sort of merge into discussion of the end goal has a union. But the definition of union didn't really exist. I mean, there were many views of what union could have been, but to consider an end goal that was not defined made it very confusing, not just for the Brits, but for the continentals as well. So my argument is also that it's not on the continent. All European countries had the same clear view of where they were heading. They didn't. And certainly the case of France and the case of Italy, the case of back then divided Germany, were extremely different. And they have, we could go case by case, but we don't have to do that. So what I'm trying to argue is also that the literature that continues to see Britain as a black sheep, those who can't get it, don't get the meaning of all this wonderful project, is actually not what was happening. There was a lot of confusion, particularly from the 70s, on what the future will be like. And even from within, the Belgian Prime Minister, the Disenchantment, was going around the European capitals trying to make sense of this and talking to people. It's interesting that he did, though. It wasn't a dogmatic politician. It was sort of and he came to London. He was trying really to work out what do we all mean. That was not really clarified after that. And the vision of union that or union that the Brits could accept is in the reflection spine. So a kind of very pragmatic sense of slow adaptation to collaboration. So collaboration is useful, is necessary, and that's what you do. You get into union together. Okay. So the real transformation, of course, happens in the. I'm really going at a lot. We already are in the period of the in the post-Suez period, and over the 1970s. So Britain has made a transition from the three circles to the adaptation to the idea of a second Europe. This idea of second Europe is something that I've used a lot, but has not been recognized officially. Politicians were not talking about it, but I think is what they have in mind, whether they try to reinvent the small Europe of the 60s, the original small Europe. So briefly, I will have to say then that we have to see the narrative evolving towards a form of adaptation that the different British governments try to work out step by step, with a lot of pressure from actually the continental side to commit themselves. There is a pressure to commit, though there is a vague idea, commit to what. So what I would like to say about the phase that follows the Labour Party very difficult experience with those years, and the success of Margaret Thatcher. Here again, I think we have a prejudiced idea of Margaret Thatcher as she was at the very, very end. In a way, the Margaret Thatcher that criticized John Major, who actually was, when she was out of government. So she becoming an Eurosceptic, but actually she had produced Euroscepticism without, in my view, being a real Eurosceptic when she was in government. So she had, I find her case particularly interesting in many ways, because we take a lot for granted. We think we know all about her. When we see through the documentation which is available, the work done by many in reconstructing really the details of the conversations between Thatcher and the leaders of the time, there are a number of aspects which become very, very interesting. And one, if I want to concentrate on the idea of narratives, is that she separated from the beginning, when she was actually in favor of the European project, even during the campaign, the referendum campaign of 1975, and her early stage in leadership, to a distinction between the budget, so what she thought was absolutely wrong, indeed, who decided it was wrong, and managing the rest of the collaboration. So she had a kind of obsessive, and that's why she achieved the result, idea that once you have fixed that that enormous issue, and from my point of view, totally wrong, the way in which she had inherited, particularly getting closer to the end of the transitional period when Britain would be in, and she was at the moment exactly when pressure was on her to deliver on that side. Then if you could fix this big issue, then the rest could be done in a form of collaborative way, particularly, of course, the transformation from the common market to the single market. That was so much in our view the most important projection of her views economically in the community. So I think it's important also not to think that Thatcher is a Eurosceptic politician, as many people now think, but more has a very realistic, with a very a very pragmatic approach to what she wanted to take and what she didn't want to take from the deal in Europe. That, of course, doesn't apply to her very late period in power. And here, people can say a lot more because of the famous issue of German reunification and how Thatcher stopped listening to people who could have advised her better on that. So the very end of her period in power is a period of not catching up, both with the evolution of Europe, which is actually more and more moving towards an idea of political union that remains vague but becomes stronger and stronger. And on the other hand, the transformation of the European and international system in a direction that is not what she would have liked to see. So trying to keep in my time, and I only have about, I think, five minutes.
I'm not going to stop you.
Okay. What I'd like to go is from the narrative that is in the making with Margaret Thatcher, so what is known now as Euroscepticism, that is produced after the end of her period in power, and how that narrative then shapes up in the period, and this I will go very quickly to cover my epilogue say of the book. So the period then of the brief period by Major, Blair, Brown, and very little that I know on Cameron because the real sources are not available yet. So what I'd like to say is that the Euroscepticism generated in a way by the Thatcher period more than generated by her, becomes an enormous political problem in terms of dealing with a public opinion in this country. And the media, particularly, support for Euroscepticism becomes more and more obvious. It's interesting what I've seen in the various papers on the Blair period, the early Blair period until 2001, 2002, how much pressure was put on the government to, from other European governments, deal with your public opinion, as if governments in this country could simply tell their public opinion, you're all wrong, stop doing this. And this extraordinary pressure from the European partners on politicians after, from Blair particularly, because Blair, what Blair does for the first time is to shift his very flexible style of politics into the European scenario framework, dealing with different groups of allies, the famous three and the other three, one with Aznar, one with both with Aznar, one with Chirac, one with Berlusconi. So creating groups of allies in his own ideas of innovation or transformation within the European scenario, bringing that kind of flexibility without actually having a very dogmatic approach against what Britain has always been standing against, which is, the erosion of sovereignty or particularly that, obviously, but being clear about it, Britain doesn't stand for that, but at the same time balancing himself in a way that was at least at first very, very popular in Europe. And that's because they thought this is a different prime minister speaks French, is younger, and so on and so forth, it's more European. Then let's, make sure. And here, what I think is very interesting, I've seen on the paper, I find it myself, it's really interesting. The archive paper is a government known for its communication strategies and knowledge in the communication field, failing completely to try to have a communication strategy in domestic politics to try to give a sense of positivity to the European project. And it's part of something I'm sure that more research could be done because more material will come out. But I think in this case, it's very interesting to see that the narrative overcome completely the politicians. Where at the beginning, the narrative and the politicians are part of the same package. At some point, the respective narrative becomes independent from the politicians in power, and that's where it becomes very, very difficult to handle. And so that of course, the story has a lot more in it, including the question of the euro, which is huge, and the way in which both Brown and Blair dealt with that, which was also, again, perceived in Europe as the lack of commitment that they would have expected, particularly from Blair at the beginning. So again, the message was deal with your public opinion and make a decision towards the euro, which didn't happen. But at this point, it's more a question of politicians debating with each other more than the old-fashioned story of Britain not getting it right, that was there at the beginning. What I'd like to conclude with is that, but the question of the narrative, why is this narrative still so strong? So the people that you talk to, people in the street, I talk to people in Europe, in most of our countries, the reason they know is that, but they never wanted to be in Europe. So I say, they came out. Of course they came out. They never wanted to be there. They know nothing, but they know this. So how is that this narrative is so strong even now? And my view is because the way in which it's been manipulated, in which the disinformation has grown during the period of a stronger and stronger media pressure in the anti-Euroscepticism direction, has made it into something that can be manipulated. So, of course, there is at the bottom something fundamentally different between the view of Europe that Britain has and many of her partners have. Though some of those partners have shifted more and more towards, in a way, the British view, which makes the absence of Britain now from the European Union more upset, because if there is a time in which probably some of European countries could stretch inside up with Britain. In any case, that view of being different, that was, if you remember after Brexit, one of the comments was, of course, de Gaulle was right. So everything that sticks to mind is Britain being. So my conclusions are that Britain wasn't that different. It was marked by obviously a very clear historical past. That the two images clash is very, very, very strong in the first period, but then that the narrative has lost, is not under control anymore. That's what I'm trying to say. As not one of the tools used by politicians to say we are on this side, the other side, has taken life of itself, which and builds on stereotypes or biases, or even in terms of language, for example. You do a linguistic study of this, the repetition of slogans that makes it into more of a propaganda tool than the political. I think that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Very much. Well, it's lovely to have Ilaria back. Seems it was only yesterday that you were in this.
Oh, yes.
And I want to make 4 comments or sets of comments on this very interesting book. First of all, to highlight a virtue of it, which you haven't signaled yourself, which is that it actually does quite a bit of research in primary sources, as well as all the secondary sources. And so I learned interesting new things about even episodes I myself have been involved in, like Tony Blair's Warsaw speech in 2000, or his lecture at this college in 2006. Ilaria goes deep into the question of who actually said what in Mitterrand's famous comment that Margaret Thatcher had the eyes of Caligula but the mouth of Marilyn Monroe. Apparently, Jacques Attali said that's not what he said at all. He said apparently Mitterrand said that he had the eyes of Stalin and the mouth of Marilyn Monroe. But Attali is an even less reliable source than
Exactly.
Never know. It's a wonderful comment anyway. And Ilaria teases out a couple of points which he's mentioned that I'd like to highlight, which I think is important. One is that quite consistent, the British approach to the European Union was about power, defense, foreign and security policy. It was not just, quote unquote, the common market. And that's also a continental misunderstanding. People endlessly say to one on the continent, oh, you only just wanted a larger common market. If you read the Commons debates on Britain's entry into what was then the EU, it's a great deal about West European security and the context of the Cold War. Then even Callaghan was keen on EPC, European Political Cooperation, which was the first beginnings of what has become the EU's foreign policy dimension, the High Representative. And Tony Blair, of course, famously said, we want not a super state, but a superpower. EU as a superpower. So that's a consistent thread, which has its echoes today in the discussion about Ukraine and European defense. Another one, and you I think finished on this, what does, I think, distinguish the approach of British politicians is a quite spectacular failure to make the case for Europe at home in Britain. And as you rightly said, the great exception was Edward Heath, who is actually the one British politician who really did make it credible that he believed in the project. Now, a good example of this is Tony Blair, who was actually a rather persuaded European and made wonderful pro-European speeches, normally in Warsaw, or Berlin, or Brussels, or Dusseldorf, not in Britain. And when I charged him with this, talking to him for my book Homeland, he gave a wonderful response. He said, well, he said, in Europe, I was pro-European, which is so revealing because he thinks about Europe as somewhere else. He doesn't think of the place where we are. And I was pro-European over there, but it wasn't worth the hassle of taking on the Eurosceptic press. And actually, I know this because I tried very hard when he gave the European Studies Centre lecture here in 2006 to get him to take on the Eurosceptic press. And all that came out in that speech after Alistair Campbell and others had a go at it was, I quote, of course, the fevered frenzies of parts of the British media don't exactly help. I have long since given up trying to conduct a serious debate about Europe in certain quarters. But it's too easy just to blame it on the media. That was all he said. Actually, it was too difficult to take on the Daily Mail and the Sun. That's the truth. And as John Lloyd, who's here, knows, he actually only did it in a lecture at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, when he talked about the British tabloid press as a feral beast. But that was when he was just about out of the door after 10 years in power. And that is, I think, a really consistent failure of British politicians. And it has a lot to do with the Eurosceptic media. Second observation, exactly what you said, Ilaria. You take on a quite well-known account of Britain's European policy, which calls us the awkward partner. Everybody in Europe is an awkward partner. France is probably the most awkward partner of all, followed by Germany. We are not unique in being an awkward partner. We're not, we was talking in the past tense, unique in skepticism about the European Union. Let me quote you a Pew poll, which was basically the last European survey conducted before the 23rd of June 2016 Brexit referendum. 71% of Greek respondents said they felt unfavorably towards the EU. 61% of the French, 61% unfavorable to the EU. 49% of the Spanish, all more than 48% of the Brits. So we were in fourth place after the Greeks, the French, and the Spanish in unfavorable view of the EU. We were by no means unique. There are lots of critical and skeptical views of the EU in many parts of Europe. Where we are unusual is in answering the question at that point that your country could better face the future outside the EU. Now there, interestingly enough, Cyprus comes top, 55%. Quite why? I'm not sure. Maybe someone here can help me understand that. But Britain comes second with 47%. Although interestingly, Austria and Slovakia 45%. But there, and so I think what is distinctive about the British is not so much skepticism and critical view of the European project, but this blithe and, of course, completely mistaken self-confidence that we'd be okay outside it. I don't think France, I don't think Germany, I don't think Italy, Spain, at least had, they may one day have, but had that self-confidence. And I think it does have a lot to do with having had an enormous empire. In fact, that Boris Johnson quoted in one of his appalling articles in the run-up to the Brexit referendum, and what you said, that on Thursday we will celebrate VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, and almost uniquely in Europe. Because, of course, there were notionally other victor powers, like Poland, but it didn't feel like much of a victory in Poland. We felt that we'd, taken on the great continental powers and won, and come out as a victor of the war. So it's a self-confidence, the mistaken self-confidence, rather than the skepticism. Third observation, I think for me the most interesting thing about this book is a point about history and historiography. Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, has a wonderful notion. He talks about the illusions of retrospective determinism, the almost irresistible temptation to believe that what actually happened somehow had to happen. And this is exactly what has happened with the historiography of Brexit. Now, it's almost entirely written as if there was an almost inevitable progress of disillusionment and growing skepticism and growing hostility, leading to that vote on the 23rd of June 2016. And as you rightly demonstrate, it isn't the case at all. There were ups and there were downs. There were political choices along the way. There were roads not taken. There were roads taken. There were periods when Britain actually played rather a positive role, believe it or not, in the history of European integration. One of them was with Margaret Thatcher, because it was a combination of the British free market conservative Margaret Thatcher and the French socialist Jacques Delors, which gave us a single market, which is still at the very heart of what the European Union actually is, the four freedoms of the single market. Another is enlargement. Tony Blair played a very significant role in pushing forward the agenda of eastward enlargement. He wanted to go even further. He was serious about taking in Turkey, but certainly in relation to Central and Eastern Europe. So it's not at all the case that Britain was always the blocking power. Just because it's such an up and down story, a story of choice and contingency, Ilaria, the one serious problem I have with your book is the title, The Long Disenchantment, because that somehow suggests that there was a process of a sort of steady, continuous design. Tell me when we were ever enchanted. I don't know when the British were ever enchanted. It was a pretty cool, pragmatic, transactional engagement with Europe from the outset. I suspect you were tempted by sort of the long goodbye, the long disenchantment. Well, you can tell us. But whereas actually, in a way, it's even more interesting. Because if you take the story forward to 2016, far from being inevitable, it is a classic story of contingency, conjuncture, and chance. It's yes, there were major structural factors which would get you to 44% belief, 45% belief. But what got you from 45% to 51% with a series of conjunctural and specific political action, the role of individuals, the fact that the refugee crisis had just happened the year before. This played massively into the debate with hugely misleading posters suggesting that all these refugees were about to come to Britain. The fact that the Eurozone crisis had taken the gloss off the European project, but also the individual choices. Michael Gove could have jumped either way. Boris Johnson was not a Eurosceptic and not a leaver. He was an opportunist. He could have gone either way. He wrote 2 newspaper columns, one arguing one way, one the other. And it was pure opportunism. And actually, John Curtis has demonstrated that there was a distinct Boris Johnson effect in the vote. And it was decided by just 650,000 votes. And Dominic Cummings, who, as you know, was the evil genius of the Leave campaign, wrote in a blog subsequently, if Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, and Gisela Stewart had not supported us and picked up the baseball bat marked Turkey NHS £350 million with 5 weeks to go, then 650,000 votes might have been lost. And that refers to, as some of you will remember, the last weeks of the campaign, when it was quite dishonestly suggested that all the Turks would very soon be joining the EU and have instant access to the United Kingdom, that Britain would not have a veto over Turkish accession. They would all immediately have access to the NHS, and instead of £350 million a week going to the EU, going to the NHS, it could go to the EU, which is a pack of lies, of course. Needless to say, but the point is, it was, amongst other conjunctural factors, decisive. And so historiographically, it's a different story. It's not a story of a sort of gradual accumulation of factors and pressures inevitably leading to this outcome. It's a story of chance and conjuncture, as it were, Cleopatra knows, which then has profound long-term structural consequences. It's the other way around. It's not long-term structural causes, but it's long-term structural consequences, because, you know, as for, what shall we say, that poor Labour MP who went very drunk one night, beat up one of his constituents, and his entire life has been ruined as a result. the consequences for Britain and the EU of this one conjuncture have been very, very profound and long-lasting and continue to be. And this is my last comment, which you don't get to go to, but I'd love to go to because I think people will be interested for the discussion. Consequences. You quoted, you remind us of the famous Winston Churchill image after 1945 of the three circles. For those of you who don't know this, Churchill's image was that Britain would be, as it were, the intersection point in a Venn diagram. There would be the big circle of the British Commonwealth, as he would have then said, and Empire, the United States, and the what he called Western Europe, West European integration. And it struck me, being when reminded of that, that in the course of these 80 years, we've gone from three circles to two, because after all, the Commonwealth didn't count for much. But in the 44 years of our membership, we were part of both the European project and the special relationship with the United States and the Anglosphere. Then after 2016, down to one, because part of the argument was we'd be much better off sticking with the United States. And now with Donald Trump, we're down to none. Right? So we've gone from three circles to none. And yet we still keep saying in our rhetoric that we're going to lead. British obsession with leadership, which Anne Dighton always points out in our rhetoric. And still we have it. With no circles left, we're still going to lead the defense of Europe, and we're going to lead in this respect and that. So I think, honestly, the most serious consequence of Brexit, so far as I can see at the moment, is not even the economic one, which is the one usually referred to. That's actually a more complicated story. But it is the decline in our geopolitical influence and soft power. But I would argue, and I'd love to hear you on this, Ilaria, that there's also been significant negative consequences for the EU, which are becoming particularly apparent when defense and security is now top of the priority list for the EU. You quote Churchill saying in a House of Commons on 25th of June 1950, I quote, "The absence of Britain deranges the balance of Europe." A wonderful word, like derangement, deranges the balance of Europe. And I think, but I'd like to hear other people in this room, and I'd like to hear you on this. I think this is true, because in my view, the ménage à trois between Britain, France, and Germany, the three big powers of the EU, actually kept the balances, the internal balances of the Union. If those three countries agreed on something, like the single market, because of their three rather different, so to speak, ideologies and approaches, but also because of their traditional partners among the smaller and medium-sized countries of the EU, you had a natural majority. In other words, even if it was a QMV point, you would have a majority. If one disagreed with the other two, then the small and medium-sized powers had someone else to go to, right? So if France and Germany agreed on something, but Britain didn't, then they could go with Britain. If Britain and Germany agreed on something, then they could go to France, and so on. So you had this constant natural balancing mechanism inside the EU. And I think the troubled state of the Franco-German relationship over recent years is not just a matter of personalities. It's also partly a matter of the lack, if you like, of the third party. That they're just two in the marriage, and it's not crowded enough to adapt Princess Diana. I actually heard a former French president who shall be nameless, who was asked about this. And he said magnificently, he said, well, indeed, of course, in every marriage there has to be a third person. The obvious indeed. But in the end, France and Germany, he said, have to stay together pour les enfants, for the children. Which I thought was a wonderful summary of French attitude to how the European Union is one. Now, maybe, and this will be an interesting subject to discuss, maybe the Weimar Triangle. Tomorrow, Friedrich Merz, having finally got himself elected after a little difficulty, is flying to Paris and then to Warsaw. So the Weimar Triangle as a structuring big three. But I just wonder if that's going to have the same compelling power to be the internal balancing act of the European Union that the Franco-British German Ménage à Trois did have, certainly not in relation to defense and security and foreign policy, which is why Ralph Dahrendorf's Second Europe, we're back to a Second Europe discussion now. The Bruegel think tank in Brussels has just proposed a European defense mechanism where actually the heart of the European defense effort would be in a new structure where Britain and Norway and potentially Ukraine would be equal members with the EU member states. So suddenly we are thinking about new architectures and geometries precisely because of Brexit. So some of the themes that go all the way through this book, it actually covers pretty much close to 80 years, recur again. But I would say, with this I finish, but I would say with both Britain and the EU in a much poorer place, in a less favorable position, in a very difficult and dangerous world, because of the tragic accident of Brexit.
Okay, just to comment on that, and then really quickly on a couple of points. There's so many things I'd like, of course, to discuss. But on the title, two things. First, the most important, and the one why I liked it, because it was a bit dry, just reassessing. So I was looking for making it a bit less dry, and somebody who I will mention in a minute suggested that. But I liked it because I was actually thinking that long disenchantment is on the European side. So it's the European that continues to be disenchanted with Britain forever. So that's how I thought it could be interpreted. But obviously it's not interpreted that way. And I realized that actually when I saw the presentation, I should say, look, I'm not the typical continental European who is going to tell you how terrible Britain has been all the way through. So I realized that, the first impression is the long disenchantment applies to Britain. It actually applies to the other side.
That's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, not what I thought of. And it is, if I may but quickly, it is true, strange enough, that there were periods of continental enchantment with Britain. And the most notable was, of course, Blairism.
Yeah, but even at first, even the sort of love and hate for the victory power, for the country never invaded, for, it's still there, it's still there, kind of fascination for imperial Britain, even when Britain imperial Britain is gone, on the continent, they can even the style, the clothes, nobody wears here anymore, the French and the Italian. Exactly. So I mean, it's exactly. But so that's one thing, and so I have to thank John for the suggestion on the long disenchantment. That's a shorter point on the geometry. I absolutely agree that actually one of the main reasons for the minor European country, including Italy, I've seen a lot of documentation of this, which is so interesting. How much Italy wanted Britain to come in, because exactly the making that force Franco-German a strong couple always there. They didn't allow for the smaller country to come into the conversation, like you have a role at all. I mean, you bring in the third party, and now you begin to be able to do that. Exactly how Tim described. So I think that the geometry of Europe benefited from the presence of Britain. Not only the geometry, as I was saying, a number of ideas that then were developed were also mentioned by Tim. The other brief comment I want to make about the narratives that I'm so obsessed with, because I actually got so impatient with, because it's repetitive and monotonous. But what I think it matters us about in seeing what happened in the case of the referendum, obviously this enormously strong media reading of what the European Union was, but also the complacency. Like I said, this was actually, and also Blair said something about that years later, that the other side, all of us, myself, I mean, even the night before, I said, this is not going to happen. Come on, this is just absurd. And how much the complacency of the non-Brexit crowd, and many of us, and intellectually, felt, because we know all this, because we know about the geometry, because we know about the real role of this country, that's how over time. I mean, we thought this is not going to happen, cannot be. But actually, the complacency was part of how the other side actually played its own narrative, with being more and more convincing. And comparing the groups that were pro-European in pro-Remain and Leave, and compared to the first referendum, we see that exactly the opposite happened in the case of the first referendum. Because the first referendum, 75, those who actually both in terms of economic power and political power and social power, if you want, they were all on the side of the staying in. But staying in was easier to promote because it was an adventure back then, with doubts, with ideas of an unknown destination, the famous journey towards an unknown destination, the short film, but still exciting journey, who knows where. And in the case of Brexit, it's the opposite. It's the end of a long journey that seemed to be becoming, according to the opposite narrative, the democratic narrative, more and more negative. So I have a lot more, but I think it will be great to hear from and respond to your questions.
Wonderful. Cornelia.
Thank you very much, Professor Poggiolini, for this presentation. I particularly liked the way in which you started with the personal narratives about the father and the grandfather fighting the resistance, and there was this kind of interaction at that time with British troops. I've been wondering in the entire picture that you very nicely put in place in front of us. Where is Italy in this picture? Italy, as Professor Garton mentioned, was not part of that balancing mechanism. It's not because it's a small country. It's not because it's relevant. It's both. The big country, very relevant, economically strong. But always got the impression it was inside and outside the circle, thinking about circles. Not exactly part of that mechanism, but contributed, we had big names contributing to that. How do you see the role of Italy in this relationship really came inside the positive, negative? I'm just wondering, what's the
Do you want me to take one at a time? Or should we take a couple? No.
Yeah, sorry, just introduce yourself.
Yes, you can.
Me? Thank you. I'm Bautista from Argentina. Thank you for the presentation. It was really good. The question goes like, now it seems that it's like an original problem to this long disenchantment, that is this idea, this UK thinking itself, or the British people actually thinking itself as not Europeans, as the Europeans think themselves to be. So my question is like, after Brexit, and also British people thinking themselves like between Europe and America, in a way, like in an island in the middle, and somebody's from here, somebody's from there. So in this situation, with Trump in the White House and what's happening in the world, and after Brexit and younger generations turning differently, you see a change there? Like you see younger British people, and also with British decline in a way, like you see younger generations becoming more not pro-European, but feeling themselves like more European and like solving that original problem, their original sin of not feeling themselves European.
Yeah, take another one? Okay, sure.
First of all, I have to admit that the long disenchantment was mine.
His fault.
Not with Ilaria, but still with his customary acuity, I saw that it wasn't her phrase, it was my phrase. And the long goodbye, I think, had something to do with it. But I think that Ilaria's defense of the title, which actually hadn't occurred to me before, was right. There was a disenchantment or enchantment on both sides, and perhaps the disenchantment was larger on the European side. Just to pick up with what the last speaker had said, which is not the point I wanted to make, it is exactly right, and Ilaria said it. Italy now, and Meloni especially, she's been in power for almost 2 years, I think, is a major player, not a major power, in what's happened in Europe. Because she, more than anyone else, is trying to straddle the United States, less so, and Europe, and trying to keep all these balls in the air. Trump, the European Union itself, Italy, and so on. And doing so, as someone mentioned earlier, with some success, making it seem as though that there is a seamless, there isn't, but it seems as though there's a seamless accord between the United States, North America, Britain, and the European Union. And that's quite a major thing, I think, that she has emerged as that kind of, as a factor, a real factor in what's happening in Europe, and continues to do so. Well, my point really is that what seems to be different now, and this is much to do with what Tim said, in fact, more to do with what Tim said, what Ilaria said, is that the difference now is something that my review mentioned, and that is the rise of the new right, the far right. And the fact that the difference now in Europe is that these large numbers, and Tim referred to it in percentage terms, these large numbers who didn't like the European Union, came not to like the European Union, now have organizing institutions, and the organizing institutions are the new right, far right parties. They now stand for something quite different politically. There's just been now the probability of a far right president in Romania, and strength seems to carry on. Whatever happens with Merz and others in Germany, the AfD presumably will kept out of power but growing in popular power, will benefit from it. And so that the parties, which now in different ways, in different and also similar ways, actually organize the popular vote, the popular dislike of Europe, are the major factor, or certainly a very large factor in how Europe goes on from now. And I think it's, I'd like to hear Ilaria on this. I've had quite a bit before, but I'd like to hear in this forum how far he thinks that, and how far Tim thinks that these parties are rather like a fly which stings and you can swat away, or are a major part, very large part of the European political scene.
Okay, we're going to start to answer the other question and leaving a big chunk of this to Tim as well. particularly in John's question. Starting with Cornelio, I think the Italian case is actually something that has helped me to understand the radical differences between the vision, federalist vision. We all know that, well-known thinkers from Italy, particularly Matteo Spinelli, who's always quoted, somebody called Piero Spinelli, as the great father of federalism. So it started for Italy even more, probably for Italy, comparatively on the same level, particularly during the Christian democratic leadership. So the post-war Christian democratic leadership in Italy, in France, and in Germany. So Adenauer, Schuman, De Gasperi. So this trio have a sort of very, very strong view of federalism has intertwined with social solidarism. So there was a church behind that, the religious Catholic view behind that. So this was a very, very strong package. They made the politicians and even the church behind them to present the European construction has the future, but also future that would really answer questions left to be answered by the previous regime. So, the social side and at the same time, the international, the pacification of Europe. So it was such a strong package that they stayed on for a very long time, which meant that very often when I have asked the politicians in Italy, about Europe, and I remember probably I told you, Tim, about this before, just before I became president of the Republic, Napolitano, who had been, an MP, former communist. I asked him at the conference in Milan, but how is that? Can you give us, kind of sophisticated as I expected, very sophisticated mind himself, description of how the Communist Party inherited the pro-Europeanism of the Christian Democrats, because that's what exactly happened. He was furious. He was absolutely, as if, I'd say, the king is naked, you can't say that. But actually, that's how Italy, this myth was created and recreated in politics until the end of the Cold War. So that's why, the Italian role was mainly saying yes to anything that could be presented as pro-European at home. So the domestic support for that was 100%. You wouldn't go against that. So, and that meant also very little initiative, because initiative means also that you may clash and the only what really is interesting is extraordinary support for British membership, and the illusion that went on in diplomacy of both countries for a long time that they could that the Italians could teach the Brits about regionalism. So the Brits, while during the accession period, they say, okay, what's called the word, give you more devolution, exactly, sorry. How to achieve a better devolution. And the Italians produced, I don't know how many pages, there was an intense exchange. So you say, what did Italy do in Europe? Well, it mainly, for the entire period of the Cold War, supported initiatives of others, because it didn't really matter politically at home. It all began to change at the end of the Cold War, and of course with the Berlusconi period. It leads up a bit to Meloni now. I think Meloni, in a way, is reinventing Berlusconi. Berlusconi, no, yeah, indeed, in terms of foreign policy, she does. I mean, Berlusconi is the first to put his face in front, he wanted to be, he had a foreign minister, but it didn't really matter. And in the case of Meloni, she is also kind of unofficially her own foreign minister. So it's a kind of reinvention of finding a space. But in the case of Meloni, I have doubts about how realistic this is. At the moment, she's playing on being more popular with van der Leyen, but that's not so hard, isn't it? I mean, to be more popular with van der Leyen. And when she went to Washington, that's where the clash between still trying to be operating within the European circle and making Trump happy. And the clash was obvious because you can negotiate directly tariffs between Italy and the United States, Italy within the common tariff of the euro. So there isn't an option of being and Trump, who doesn't know this thing called dollar, doesn't care about this thing with a glove. They're only going there. Now we do a deal on fashion, or we do a deal. He loves announcing this thing. It just cannot happen. So Meloni has to balance herself between the reality of being within the European Union, with all that comes with it, and try to be the voice, more or less, a kind of not officially the voice of Brussels, but a voice that doesn't clash with Brussels, and at the same time. So it's a difficult game to play. Just a word about the generations and the Britishness. I think it's actually, I found over time, also being around in this country, and having also students in history or somewhere else from this country, I think that I always make that point. Generations lived within being part of the European Union had clearly experimented this freedom of movement within, that also applies to education, applied to education on both sides. So there has been a Europeanization, I think, of younger British citizens. I think it will continue. I cannot imagine, but maybe I am complacent. I tend to think that it's going to continue with difficulties, particularly from the European side and the cost of education here and so on. But it's a door that is, for me, difficult to close. At the same time, I would say that not being European is not what I was arguing that the Brits really were. I was arguing that the Brits were seen as such. And I think actually the view that many have expressed, political leaders, at least on this point, of being European, that meant, particularly Thatcher made that point so clearly, doesn't mean to be part of the European Union, that the concept of Europe is broader than the union, the community first and the union after. So being a European is certainly within the DNA of the British people of any generation, I think. It depends on what European means. It may not mean the structures of the European Union. I leave it to him to...
It's three quick comments. First is, now I've understood the title. I think the term disenchantment is almost too weak. What really strikes me, traveling around the continent in the last few years, is precisely those countries that felt closest to Britain. Ireland, Portugal, the Netherlands, to some extent Germany, are the most bitterly disappointed by Britain leaving, and people will use the words like abandoned us or even betrayed us. There's a real sense of, you were our best friends in Europe, you were our closest allies in Europe, and you betrayed us. Actually, Merkel says something very much like this in her memoir. So it's actually stronger than disenchantment. It's a sense of betrayal precisely amongst those who are most enamored of it. Secondly, on this very interesting question you asked about changing attitudes to Europe, I mean, self-evidently, British society has gone through a massive process of Europeanization over the last half century. When the Polish philosopher Leszek Krakowski first arrived in Oxford in 1969, he walked around the city and came home, and his wife said, "What's it like?" And he says, "Very, very beautiful," he says. But that's one thing I don't understand. Where are the cafes? There were no cafes in Oxford. There were two places called cafes, where you would get mugs of chicory essence, but there were no cafes. Now you can't walk 10 yards without coming across a cafe. And that's a superficial thing, but in so many respects, we are classic European, rather social democratic country, our attachment to the welfare state, if you look at social attitude surveys and so on. And also, there are 5 million plus EU citizens who have a permanent right to remain in the United Kingdom. 5 million. I would like them all to become British citizens. But that would really be a force in British elections. And of course, with time, they will be able to. So in so many different ways, this country has been deeply Europeanized. But I'm afraid with time, particularly if we don't get things like the youth mobility scheme, this will fade, and it's certainly faded in the rhetoric. Even pro-Europeans are now habitually talking about Europe as somewhere else. Whereas 20 years ago, now and then we did actually talk about Europe, including us. And so I think there is a creeping alienation effect that comes from being outside the EU. And in the EU, it's very striking to me. To use a German phrase, Britain is weg vom Fenster. It's out of it. And the whole conversations that we had, for example, about a European nuclear deterrent. And it's amazing that the whole conversation about that in Germany, which is all about France, didn't even mention the British nuclear deterrent, although the British nuclear deterrent is the only one actually committed to the defense of the NATO area. So the knock-on effects of Brexit are very clear. Last point, and this goes to John's about the hard right parties. Look, they are clearly a major and growing force in European politics. There's evidently the polls, both opinion polls and actual elections, show that. There has always been an anti-liberal Europe as well as a liberal Europe. Somewhere on these shelves there's a very good book about the whole history of anti-liberal Europe. What is new is that it has support now, not just from Russia, but from the United States, from J.D. Vance and from Elon Musk. And that gives it a whole new dimension. If you have an anti-liberal United States, together with an anti-liberal Russia and an anti-liberal Turkey and an anti-liberal China, actively supporting hard-right populist nationalist parties inside Europe. And I think at some point fairly soon, if not now, we have to have a serious conversation about what we do about it. Because if these parties persistently get 25% of the vote, 30% of the vote, 35% of the vote, are we always, all the time, to continue to say they cannot be part of mainstream democratic politics? Currently, the German approach. I mean, I support the firewall, because your parties are absolutely free to say we're not going to get into bed with other parties. But are we going to say that they don't have a right to, for example, chairs of parliamentary committees, at some point to have some role in government? I think it's a real dilemma for liberal Europe.
Guardian peace, perhaps.
You can feel it coming on.
I can take one more round of questions. Yes.
Been a fascinating discussion. We need more of it, I think. I just wanted to make one observation and then ask a question. The observation is that I so agree with him when he talked about a tragic accident. It reminded me of what A.J.P. Taylor always used to talk about at the beginning of his lectures, that history can be changed by something very small, as well as by long trends and so on, which are very attractive to write about. And he always gave the example of Richard III losing his spur and then his horse, and then you change the dynasty of the British rulers. And actually, at 4 o'clock on the day of the vote, there was a huge thunderstorm in London, and it went on for about 2 hours. And there are estimates that the number of people who then decided not to vote in London, which is obviously a very supportive remaining city, might have been enough, to 650,000. So little things can change and so on. My question is about the long disenchantment, and I wondered if it's also about settling historical scores. Now you mentioned, and I don't think we need to discuss it, the episodes with de Gaulle, and we might say that he hated the arrogance of the British. We might say that. I always remember saying he was worried about Britain bringing in US influence through the back door, and maybe he was also worried about his personal status in Europe as being, the big man or a big man. But then the question that always occurred to me was why in the debates in the run-up to the Brexit vote, Europeans didn't work harder to make a better case with Cameron for Britain to stay in. Now, I know he came and got a number of special deals, which he didn't sell very well, and they're actually quite good ones. We look back on it, but I just think that if Merkel had really played a bigger role to remind Europe and incidentally Britain about the special contributions that Britain had made, we've discussed some of them, then surely that could have been kind of influential. It's too easy to say, oh, we didn't interfere in someone else's politics. That's a cop-out. And I just feel that, does that go back to this idea of the long disenchantment, the settling of scores? I mean, I just don't think Europe, it's all very well, Tim, for people to say they feel abandoned and betrayed, and I agree with you, that is what they say. But why didn't they work a little bit damn harder? Because Cameron didn't want to leave. He was the prime minister. This was a misguided strategy to deal with a particular problem, UKIP and Farage. And, everybody could have coalesced, and 650,000 votes could easily have gone the other way.
One of the things you seem to do is draw on primary sources as a corrective against some of the things that you say. So myths, narratives, disinformation, pressure. And to what extent is there an ability to reset some of these relationships based on the research that you are offering? Because you're putting forward a different set of stories, aren't you? There's a more complex set of actors whose relationship, as you say, is shifting over time. We seem to be at another shift at the moment. So to what extent can we engage with some of these primary materials to move some of these narratives in perhaps some more progressive directions against some of the anti-liberal forces?
Okay, let me start with the goal. Actually, there's been I am fond of trying to penetrate the discussion within this choreography and then try to say something new if I can. And there's been a really massive, very interesting revisionist historiography on the goal, and particularly on the goal in Europe, and on the goal and the leaders. And basically, we want to say something very simply. This much more complicated than this, but the real reason is not at all that the goal had become, a real problem in Britain. De Gaulle knew perfectly well that CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, was one of the biggest obstacles in front of, the kind of policy that Britain would do anything they could to dismantle if they came in. So he was protecting his lobby. I mean, he was taking, the culture that rural France was his constituency. He was protecting the most expensive and major policy in Europe before the end of Little Europe. So he had a very strong interest to keep Britain out, and he had the prestige and the capacity and the persona to do it in a mass. Think about now that one of our European leaders gets up one day and say, no, we're not going to do that. Gives in a press communique said, this is not going to happen, without consulting with anybody, without just we really think about it, those two reasons I explained. And people said, okay, all right, we go live in one place. But also the second, after the first one and the second, Little Europe and the rest, they say, well, but we actually won Britain. So we actually obtained the opposite result. But to go on the question of them, if the narrative that Britain now are being unwanted, I think that's what we have really. I mean, this comes in. We can take it together with the issue of sources in a way, because many of those stereotypes, and that's why in my conclusions I was saying that maybe the narratives used, the misuse of narratives in the not only at the time of Brexit but before Brexit and after Brexit. So the so-called disinformation attitude, while you use existing concepts, but you twist them or manipulate them, is something that is actually what I was trying to undo. Meaning that it's in the case of the goal is one of them. I mean, the number of cases in which, we really, if we go back, the traditional, in the old days, it was called diplomatic stories. I'm not certainly diplomatic stories. I'm fascinated with stories and narratives, but you go back to dig what these people said, and there's a lot we can learn from that. Which means that again, but the point I think I've got a second part of this question. Should have taken note. What was the second part of your question?
Could Europe have done more?
Yeah, that's right. Well, could Europe have done more is actually something I do know a little bit more, but I would love to see, Cameron's paper in order to really have a verdict on that. Well, I think it happened at the time was that the pressure that Cameron put to obtain what he obtained was done in a less, it's been compared to the first renegotiation and perhaps in an inability of playing the card diplomatically appropriately. But on the other hand, there's also a point in which the European Union began to feel stronger than the continuous British demand. So you say that would have been perhaps the moment of help, but was also exactly the moment in which nobody wanted to help anymore. So it's a kind of, it was too much. You got the opting out, most people thought, Britain is in the best possible position. Is already capable of staying out from a number of things that actually Cameron wanted to be codified, but largely already existed. So I think that it was a reaction of saying, okay, we've played this game with you, British, for a long time. You're the only country in Europe that has, a particular status on a number and has worked out from other commitments enough. So I think it went. But I would love to see the sources of this.
Afraid we have to draw it to a close now, but there will be a chance afterwards to have a conversation and to continue it. I would like to say a huge thank you to Professor Timothy Garton Ash for discussing the work and sharing his reflections, and a huge thank you to Ilaria Poggiolini for sharing her book with us. Do please have a look and add it to all of your readings. Thank you very much.